Good afternoon. Here at the Institute of Archaeology of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and also hello to our online visitors as well. It is a great honor for me to welcome Professor Timothy Taylor, who, even though the announcement is like from Comenius University in Bratislava, but he has a long history of studying and research behind him. And so he studied in St. John's College at University of Cambridge. And then within the university, he then moved to Queen's College and then to the King's College, which goes all the way up.
They were both Oxford.
They were both Oxford, sorry. Confusing. Too many colleges. And he then later became lecturer and even later reader of archaeology at the University of Bradford. And later in 2012, he became professor of prehistory of humanity at the University in Vienna. And yet later, in 2020, he became Jan Eisner professor at the Department of Archaeology at Comenius University in Bratislava. He's best known possibly for his books. He likes to present these large narratives. The first one of them was named The Prehistory of Sex, which obviously attracts. Then followed The Buried Soul, How Humans Invented Death in 2004. And the more recent one is The Artificial Ape, How Technology Changed the Course of Human Evolution in 2010. But he covers a broad spectrum of topics, and his most recent paper in an edited volume deals with slavery. So that's a whole range. But he's known also for his editorial work. For 10 years, he was a board member of the influential New Directions in Archaeology monograph series. And possibly more importantly, in the past over 10 years, he's editor-in-chief of the relatively high-ranked, the third best in the Scopus list, a Journal of World Prehistory, which he still continues. And with this, I would give the word to him and ask him to deliver the lecture.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I will try to keep to time. I can shorten as we go. My title, The Persistence of Innocence. Let me just see. Oh, there we are. Whoops. No. This one. I'm used to Mac. Why is that? There we are. Okay, it's working. The Persistence of Innocence, David Clarke, 50 years on. And I'm going to talk freely, but I've got a few pieces of text in here just to keep my mind focused. And in a sense, this is the executive summary, that the failure, I claim, to separate the analytical from the interpretive in archaeological reasoning and explanation has been a persistent problem. First, clearly addressed by David Clarke in his 1973 Archaeology, The Loss of Innocence. Successive generations of scholarship have noted the importance of the separation in principle. Arguably, however, they failed to provide a guide in practice for establishing it in specific cases. The problem is closely related to the extent to which our modern analytical ethic distinctions and classifications actually, excuse me, a bit to the side. I can. Can I move here? Fine, okay, I'm just moving around here. So the problem is closely related to the extent to which our modern analytical or ethic distinctions and classifications actually map onto the original culturally informed and emic distinctions and classifications that we may also be interested in uncovering. How we can ever know that such things have been uncovered involves a problematic systematically addressed by scholars such as Rickert, Croce, and Collingwood, but has never been satisfactorily resolved. The current application of IBE, inference to the best explanation, may mark an advance, but it does not finally solve things. The issue is fundamentally one of uncovering our own pre-theoretical commitments concerning our understanding of the thing we label human nature, and I will hope to unpack that. I've recently argued that the significant challenge here is to bring to light what we may be unaware of, so as to broaden the scope of plausible, that's believable, accounts of past human behavior. I'll just begin then with my poster, because I should explain what is apparent here, and maybe begin with this object, which is unpublished and very recently excavated, dates to around about 10,000 to 10,500 BC, because we haven't published it yet. Its work led by Urs Leutzinger in one of the Swiss cantons, with my colleague Jean-Nicolas Haas as well, who is an archaeobotanist. And I'm going to move to simply explaining in the beginning the images that we've used on the poster for this lecture. And the first is this red deer antler object, which has got an AMSC 14 date between 10,000 and 10,500 BC. It comes from the Abri site of Flößebendli in Canton Schweiz. It's going to be published soon, but in looking at the draft of the data, the earliest provisional title contained the term new epipaleolithic art. And when I came on board, I know Urs and Jean-Nicolas well, I said, well, I'm bothered about that, and I'll tell you why. And I was bothered about some other things around it as well. It's from this site, but I'm particularly concerned that once we say it's art, we've already slipped from an analytical into an interpretive mode without having done analysis. And this is what David Clarke warned us against. And also in the documentation of this small antler find, one of the things that has been done by the team is to count these rows of dots and present numerical data for the dots. And I'm going to suggest also that this is only CAPTA and is not necessarily emic data. And that in a sense, we are in danger of playing to a playbook that is in fact more to do with 20th century considerations about plausibility than it is to do with the original target intentionality. And I will come back to that once we've gone through a little bit of David Clarke. And the other picture we don't need to dwell on so much, but it is relevant. It's just, it's a little revised sketch I've made from a famous, the so-called Spider-Man, possibly headless, possibly not. I've never been to the site. It's in Burnt Bluff in Michigan, and it dates into the AD period. But there's some relevance we're going to see about number, which you may already have gathered. Okay, so in a sense, the person I'm honouring in this lecture, David Clarke, 1937 to 1976, would have been possibly one of my teachers. I went to Cambridge in '79, and he died very unfortunately of a medical emergency, very young, with, in a sense, his mature potential unfulfilled. Published analytical archaeology, first edition, 71, I think, maybe it was 68 now, I'm not sure. There are several, that's probably the 71 paperback actually. And then it was 2 years after his death, it was re-edited in a slightly shorter form by Bob Chapman, who is a great friend of mine and on my editorial board these days. And I could say that this version is probably my single most used archaeology book. I've used it in teaching through over 20 years of teaching in Bradford, in Vienna, and so on. It's a kind of a Bible. It's not very easy to read, and that's maybe one of the reasons that one has to go back and read it again and again. Simon Stoddart and Carolyn Malone, when they were editing Antiquity 25 years ago now, can it be, made a special section in 25 years later, and I'm intending that this talk should be the basis of something that I'm offering to Antiquity. Obviously, it'll have to be peer reviewed, so who knows, but they've shown an interest for next year, which will be the 50th anniversary of the paper. In this introduction to this special section, which I think included some comments by Steve Shannon, Simon Stoddart and Carolyn Malone say in the late 60s and early 1970s, the editor of Antiquity, Glyn Daniel, invited a series of reactions to the cross currents of archaeology at the time. The first was a conservative statement on archaeology as the servant of history by Jacquetta Hawkes, 1968, urging the humanistic study of archaeology and that it should be saved from scientific approaches. And there was a lot of reaction to that article across the piece, but two students, young students, stepped up to claim a prize for how they saw the future. And those were Eshwen Neustupny and Glyn Isaac in this thing to talk about wither archaeology. I should have put a picture of Glyn Isaac in because he was a very nice man. I knew all of these people. It shows how old I am now, being 62. That's Jacquetta Hawkes. She was on the trustee board of Antiquity when I was an assistant editor. Glyn Daniel, who was my first professor at Cambridge before Colin Renfrew. And then, in a sense...
Professor of Cambridge.
Hello? Strange voices in the ether. In a sense, I had some sort of there was some sort of an apostolic succession for me via my great friend Andrew Sherratt, who had been taught by David Clarke, and I guess I picked up a lot of inspiration for really William Clarke from Andrew. And Andrew was, of course, a friend of Eshwen Neustupny and persuaded me to. I didn't need persuading, ordered me when I was at Oxford to drive Eshwen round Avebury and Silbury Hill and Stonehenge, and we had a very nice day out. Let's cut to the chase and the article, Archaeology, the Loss of Innocence. Just going to put my watch there. Daniel says, here, Dr. David Clarke, fellow and tutor of Peterhouse, Cambridge, sets out his considered views, I'll put it in Glyn's voice, sets out his considered views on the name and nature of archaeology. And Glyn was very patrician, I think I can say that. There's something paternalistic about this. And when one realizes that they were both competing for the Disney chair, the professorship at Cambridge at the time, I think Glyn knew that this article would be highly inflammatory, which it was, and whether or not it aided, it probably didn't help Clarke's attempt to gain the chair. What does he say? Well, it's a piece that I read almost every year and reread. The loss of disciplinary innocence is the price of expanding consciousness, is the opening paragraph. Certainly the price is high, but the loss is irreversible and the prize substantial. Although the loss of disciplinary innocence is a continuous process, we can nevertheless distinguish significant thresholds in the transition from consciousness through self-consciousness to critical self-consciousness and beyond. He later specifies the beyond as self-critical self-consciousness and expanded consciousness and various things, but he never quite nails that down. Consciousness is perhaps achieved when the discipline is named and largely defined by specifying its raw material and by pragmatic practice. Archaeology is what archaeologists do. And he says its practitioners are linked within an arbitrary but common partition of reality, sharing intuitive procedures and tacit understandings, that is, non-explicit understandings, while teaching by imitation and correction in the craft style. So you have your students, you show them, this is archaeology, this is what we do. Gradually, he says, consciousness that you're doing that develops into self-consciousness, and sophistication erodes the paradigms of innocence. Self-consciousness dawns with explicit attempts at self-knowledge, the contentious efforts to cope with the growing quantity of archaeological observations by explicit but debated procedures, and the querulous, the uncertain definition of concepts and classifications. The discipline emerges as a restless body of observations, he says, and the politics and sociology of the disciplinary environment increasingly develop an authoritarian state in which each expert has a specialist territory, such that criticisms of territorial observations are treated as attacks upon personalities. And I think it's probably fair to say I've experienced that myself, because I range well outside my original Oxford research area, which is Iron Age Taureutic art of the late Hallstatt and early Latin period, and basically step edge Iron Age iconographies. And because I've worked, maybe foolishly, but I've worked across a whole range of thematics in many periods. I don't consider myself to be period bound, but some people, not all, but many, take that as attacks, or that you shouldn't be doing it because there's a silo concept. And so not all of these things, he's producing a sort of a typology of increasing self-consciousness, but it certainly isn't been a stadial succession. One can see vestiges of the first model, in fact, in many places. But he says in this second stage, the prevailing feeling is, look how much we know. Sorry, in the first stage, the prevailing feeling is, look how much, no, sorry. He does say, in this area of specialization, the feeling is, look how much we know. But it emerges in a new level of disciplinary consciousness, critical self-consciousness, in which attempts are made to control the direction and destiny of the system by a closer understanding of its internal structure and the potential of the external environment. Focus switches from the heap of data to the vast sample space. And the prevailing feeling is now, look how little we know and how inappropriate are our models and explanations. He says, demoralizing but fundamental questioning develops. Given what we now know about the limitations of the data, concepts, and methods, how do we know what we appear to know reliably? Nobody really talked about data security before. He was one of the first people to talk about knowledge security and epistemology in an explicit sense. And he then talks about the consequences arising from the introduction of new methodologies. And here he's particularly thinking of radiocarbon chronometric dating and neutron activation analysis, all the new thin section analyses which were coming in the late 60s and early 70s, as well as metallurgical provenance and so on. And he then says that basically all archaeologists are using concepts, whether they know it or not. This is, I think, one of his points, which, to paraphrase, he thinks you've only got two choices about theory. You either explicitly use archaeological theory and you design what it is and know what it is and interrogate yourself over your theory, or you are using theory without knowing it, and therefore you have tacit theories which, in a sense, remain unexamined, which is not obviously critically self-conscious. And he uses the word metaphysical in this sense to mean to do with the absolute categories of thoughts. That's going very fast. His main point in analytical archaeology, and he brings it, in a sense, into a sort of a lapidary form in The Loss of Innocence, is the problem of the development of general theory. Do we have a general theory? He says one of the prizes denied us by the partitioned regionalism and specialism of the old archaeology is the explicit realization that there is or could be a comprehensive archaeological general theory. The difficulty with this intriguing possibility has never been a lack of forms which this theory might take and areas within which it might fulminate, but rather the converse, the infinity of kinds of theory which might conceivably be appropriate for archaeology, and the familiar problem of choice, where to search in the infinity. And he then says that earlier responses were to import theory, and gives an example of Child's importation of Marxism. But this is, in a sense, where we get to Clarke at his absolute best, because he basically is analytical. And he says that we have to go through a range of steps. And there are 6 steps in what we do archaeologically. The first 4 are here. These are the steps latent in any archaeological interpretation, relating 1, the range of hominid activity patterns and social and environmental processes which once existed over a specified time and area. That's, in a sense, the past as it was. There is a past, an sich, so to speak, that was there. And just like light from a distant pulsar can still be recorded as some things happened and other things didn't. The sample and traces of these, 1, that were deposited at that time, so the impact at the time of routines. This is something obviously that Lewis Binford and Michael Schiffer later began to study. Number 3, the sample of that sample, which survived to be recovered. So that's, in a sense, taphonomic and post-depositional processes, or what Schiffer would call N transforms, but maybe C transforms as well. And then 4, the sample of that sample, 3, which was recovered by excavation or collection. So that's his first level of filters, which mean that you have predispositional and depositional theory covering the nature of the relationships between specified hominid. He uses that term because he includes the whole of the Paleolithic from then the older one. He would now include the Namequian through to yesterday, or indeed today. Social patterns and environmental factors, one with another, and with the sampling traces which were at the time deposited in the archaeological record. I think I'll go a bit more quickly here. Post-depositional theory, description thereof. Retrieval theory, description thereof. Then we get 2 more levels. Analytical theory, the nature of the relationships between the observations, 4, which become the data. It's very important that data is created. It's not just there. It becomes data. And their subsequent operational treatment under selective modeling, testing, analysis, experimentation, storage, and publication. largely a theory of information retrieval, selection, discarding, evaluation, compaction, and decision costs, linking 4 back to 1 via the interpretive theory, which is in a sense the next level, but toggles in and out with the analytical theory. The nature of the relationships between archaeological patterns established by analysis and verified by experiment, and predictions about the directly unobservable ancient behavioral and environmental patterns, largely a theory of prediction, explanation, and model evaluation, linking 4 back to 1 by testing expectations derived by analogy against, I'll come back to that, against observations manipulated by analysis given 2, 3, and 4. Okay. This is the reason I read this every year, and you as non-native English speakers may be finding this really hard to cope with, is it appears to be jargon laden. In fact, it's very analytically clear. And you'll notice anybody who reads Clarke will see a very strong distinction between his analytical archaeology writing and him writing narrative prehistory, which he considers to be a product, the interpretive product of the analytical level. So he really kept these quite separate in his mind. Anyway, let's move to something kind of more graphic and graspable, I hope. How might Clarke's admonishment to keep the analytical and interpretive levels separate apply to a specific example? So I'm going to take 2 actually, but we're going to begin with Middle Upper Paleolithic burial. They're just going to take us into the Pavlovian, Willendorfian, Kostjonkian between 30 and 22,000 years ago, the Mammoth Steppe, the Gravettian, and you'll all be very familiar with the triple burial of Dolny Kostonice, which I have had the pleasure to examine actually, although not as an anthropologist, but I have seen all of the material, and indeed I've published it as an example a couple of times. And when I published it in the Prehistory of Sex with some interpretations, it was thought that the central or the 3 bodies appear to be genetically related, appear to be morphologically related. These most similar, a prone male, a male with his hands in the area of the pelvis of what at that time, when I wrote the book, was thought to be a female. And in fact, within the last 4 years, I think it's now been shown on genetics that these are in fact all males, and this may be in fact the father of these 2 late adolescent boys. I was interpreting, in a sense, on the basis of the data I had at that time, and then I reinterpreted when I wrote The Buried Soul, and others have as well. There's been a lot of, in a sense, ink spilt over the interpretation of this burial. But I want you to just pay attention. I keep using the word burial, and what I've done here is I'm actually using an interpretive term ahead of analysis, which is a mistake. I shouldn't have said it, but we all do this all the time. Because when we look at Gravettian burials, we have the paired burial, we've got triple burial at Dolny Kostonice, a paired burial at Sungir, we've got a triple burial at Barma Grande in Italy, and so on. This is one of the most recent ones published by friends and colleagues, Mark Hendel, Maria Teschel-Nicola, Thomas Einberger, Christine Neugebauer-Maresch. I know them all well, and Ron Pinhasi, who I work with. I wish I'd been included on this paper, but you'll see why I wasn't, because I actually really massively disagree with, at the interpretive level, about what has been said here, and they'll learn this first, I think. And this is where one doesn't, there's a problem with these silos, and I'm actually feeling kind of nervous. Do I go public and say what I think is wrong with this? Because the work is impeccable. The work that has been done is impeccable because it shows that these are monozygotic newborn twins from the site of Kremsbachberg. One has died before the other, and they've been buried together. And in the Nature Science News, it says buried babies suggest prehistoric compassion. They may have been considered equal members of prehistoric society because they've been buried in an elaborate manner. And this is not the only time that such claims are made. Here is the chondrodystrophic dwarf from Romito 2, and this has also been subject of a recent reanalysis. I also discussed it in The Buried Soul. And Lorna Tilley, in her International Journal of Paleopathology paper, talks about the care that the community gave to this individual, accommodating difference in the prehistoric past. This speaks to a modern agenda of disabled rights, of diversity, of compassion, and to a Rousseauian concept of us as to be regarded as nice, to be regarded as part of a species that does good. And probably the apogee of this, which is where it gets sucked up into, is something some of you may be familiar with, this book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, David Graeber and David Wengrow, which I've just read cover to cover on the train and the plane yesterday. I hadn't wanted to, but I've been asked to review it. I suspected what I would find inside, and I haven't been disappointed. Now, that may not be the right way of putting it. Let's see what they say. Well, actually, the Romito burial is a very key early example. And this is their language from the book. Romito 2 is the 10,000-year-old burial of a male with a rare genetic disorder, which in life would have rendered him both anomalous in his community and unable to participate in the kind of high-altitude hunting that was necessary for their survival. This community still took pains to support this individual through infancy into early adulthood, granting him the same share of meat as everyone else, and ultimately according him a careful, sheltered burial. They go on. Neither is Romito 2, an isolated case, my typo there, not theirs. There are in such burials high frequencies of health-related disabilities, but also surprisingly high levels of care until the time of death and beyond, since some of these funerals were remarkably lavish. Thus, they conclude, explicitly contra Thomas Hobbes, the anti-Rousseauian position, and Steven Pinker, ditto, in origin, it might be claimed our species is a nurturing and caregiving species, and there was simply no need for life to be nasty, brutish, or short. No wonder this book is a bestseller around the world. Well, this is the situation at Romito, where we have the dwarf is actually buried. You can see here, we get the hands in the pelvic region of a second, very short adult woman, probably his mother, who isn't congenitally affected, but is certainly well below average height. Burial here is explicitly linked to a funeral having happened, and the framing of the observations around care implies some natural death, at least one the community was at pains to avoid. So Graeber and Wengrow's until the time of death seems genuinely naive, because the implication at first, it ignores the well-supported assumption that natural death was effectively unknown as a metaphysical concept until the last couple of centuries in some limited parts of the world under a scientific Weltanschauung. I mean, you won't find any anthropologist of the 19th century who would ever discuss people saying a natural death has occurred. It's simply not a category prior to post-Enlightenment thinking. And I can also say I have an expertise that I don't talk about very much. It's not in my CV typically, but I work for the National Crime Agency in Britain. I have done for over 20 years on ritual crime and harmful cultural practices, things like type 2 female genital mutilation. I wrote the witchcraft report on a case that was successfully prosecuted at the Old Bailey in London 3 years ago, and I'm working on a current case, but I've worked on a number of cases which have involved people who were alive not being alive anymore, if you take my meaning. And to take one example, because I've been looking at how death is understood in West Africa in the present day, in the 2020s, and all death is considered the result of witchcraft. There's no, you can't live in Ghana or Nigeria without believing fundamentally that any death, all death, is the result of witchcraft. And you might say, well, what about people who get very old? Isn't it obvious that when somebody gets very old, they're going to die? Yes, of course it's obvious, because they get too weak to fight the witches off. So that's not a natural death. That's that you didn't keep your strength up to fight the witches off. And burial, assuming a funerary ritual which in turn assumes a natural death. Why did Graeber and Wenger ignore the fact that the dwarf is not buried alone, has his hands posed so as to reach into the pelvic genital region of the very short but not congenitally abnormal corpse of the person with him, and that this skeleton is presumed to be his mother, who has apparently died at just the same time of natural causes. Now, Alison Wiley has warned us of the interpretive dilemma, where labeling something pre-interprets it. If we say we want to interpret the Romito burial, we should be aware that it is in that moment 95% interpreted. We pre-interpreted it because we called it the Romito burial. So we want to interpret this burial, but you just did. You said it was a burial. If we follow Clarke and keep the analytical level separate, then Romito 2 is the archaeological revelation and record of a structured deposition of certain human perimortem remains and all the observations and tests that can be done on them and their context. The deposition can be inferred to be deliberate, not accidental, and thus to have had purpose and meaning. Of course, it's possible to make interpretive moves ahead of some analyses. Probably it's impossible not to make some assumptions, but you then have to test them. These should then be used to determine new analyses, e.g. test predictions on health status, age, cause of death, etc. Cause of death is virtually unknown for any of the Upper Paleolithic, Middle Upper Paleolithic burials. They're all mysteriously dead. They don't have sharp force trauma. They don't have blunt force trauma. They're just dead. And they're pretty perfect skeletons, except that they've all got congenital illnesses. Pretty much all of them have something weird about them. Either they're twins or they're very short or something or something. So those things, those new analyses, will need careful re-separation from the ongoing background of interpretive speculation that stimulates them. And as Vide, Alison Wiley cables and tacking. So now, what I'm saying here in calling into question the idea that these are simple funerary burial events was in fact tackled by my colleague and friend Paul Pettit, who is a bona fide Paleolithic archaeologist in the Paleolithic origins of human burial, in which he goes, I think he knows I will say this, halfway towards saying there's something weird going on here. He talks about very different attitudes to the corpse and the body, potential endocannibalism in some cases, posing, treatments, and the fact that many of these are non-normal individuals. And he moves away from the idea that Gravettian burial is part, that we're seeing a subset of a normative rite, which we certainly aren't. This is not very special, very honored burials from a big background. of, if you like, normative, demographically normative burial. I went a lot further in Buried Soul to suggest, and you don't need to believe me for me to make this point, obviously, for me to make this point, because it's about Clarke and how we go forward, because I don't know if I'm right, but I said, what if these are tableaux? What if they represent ritual killings? What if they are there as part of social control? What if they are there as a kind of a, I didn't use this term, as a kind of prehistoric eugenics, that people who are odd are in a sense kept as exemplary specimens of that oddity until such a time as community renewal is required. And through a process of scapegoating and then high ritualization, they are put to death and posed or offered to some deity or to some posterity in a way that has important social effects in terms of cohesion and reproductive fitness of the group. What if, I said. And one of the, about 8 years later, so that's 2002, 2010, Alexandra Piontelli, MD, Italian doctor who has worked around the world as a midwife, published this book, which no social anthropologist could have published, called Twins in the World, The Legends They Inspire and the Lives They Lead. I get moved by stuff sometimes with the police work I do and so on. I would recommend you don't read this book if you're feeling depressed, because it's utterly shocking in a way. She shows that in the modern world, a remarkable account of scapegoating and ritual killing of twins in many indigenous communities worldwide. It notes the empirical risk increases of mothers with twins. So this is well known, not just in hunter-gatherer societies who hardly ever tolerate twins because of mobility and lactation. The energy costs of having twins in hunter-gatherer societies virtually impossible, because breastfeeding is around about 18% of your total energy expenditure, and carrying is around another 20%. You could about 40% of your, as a woman, of an energy expenditure tied up with mobility and breastfeeding at once, right, of a neonate. So if you have twins, that doesn't leave you very much energy in your bodily budget, right? So they're not usually tolerated at all in mobile hunter-gatherers, but even in pastoralist and in farmer economies, twins are seen as a strain. She doesn't actually talk about pragmatic solutions, such as killing one of them. Instead, she sees that both are killed, sometimes as neonates, but in some communities much later, such as at puberty, as part of a purging of witchcraft and evil, which the twins are supposed to represent. It's basically the logic of this, whether you're talking about Bihar province in India or the Congo Basin or Amazonia, Papua New Guinea, but it's many places where she's been. The logic is that there are two bodies where there should be one. There's particularly that issue that there's one soul matter and two bodies. And the late killings are often graphically complex and tortuous and imagistic. So they are examples of horror and cruelty. Now, you might say, well, can that really be part of the typical mode of how humans behave? And I think all of us have Ukraine in our minds at the moment and what we know and what we don't know. But that's why I'm a Hobbesian, because I feel that we should be warned, and I don't think we should take an overly sentimental view about the past and escape into a past as wished for, which is actually what I think Bengro and Graeber largely do. Harvey Whitehouse, in a way, this is a very interesting intervention in its divergent modes of religiosity, contrasted powerful and infrequent imagistic rites, which are typically highly visceral, ritual killing, in its various forms is a classic example. And doctrinal mode of everyday non-arousing habitual rites and observances. And this is quite a while ago now, and I think he's moved to some extent from this maybe caricature. We have spoken, although not specifically, I guess, about my concern that the everyday doctrines could also include highly visceral rites for reasons of social benefit, sensu lato. I think in some ways we can easily be lulled into thinking that people couldn't have been that much unlike ourselves today with the freedom to do science and come together like we are in this room. And I would recommend reading Victor Nell's 2006 Cruelty's Rewards, the Gratifications of Perpetrators and Spectators in Behavioral and Brain Sciences 29, which is a sort of a go-to paper on why this is not implausible. In saying that perhaps everyday doctrines could include highly visceral rites for reasons of social benefit, sensu lato, we are addressing and overcoming what Margaret Masterman in 1970 called the sociological paradigm, which is that framing of thought that's more insidious than the metaphysical paradigm, which obviously we all are part of the metaphysical paradigm, the fundamental ideas of cause and effect, or even the concept of cause itself, or the construct paradigm, which clearly David Clarke was addressing with the new archaeology, the available, in his time, the expansion of the available observing and analytical tools and methods. The sociological paradigm governs the plausibility level, historically and culturally situated, of different claims concerning possible and likely human behaviors. So we see in their Romito 2 case that Graeber and Vengro's referencing of the analytical, isotopic, etc., documentation of care, e.g. nutritional care, is smeared by them into the interpretive imputation of care, e.g. compassionate, sentimental. It's a classic example of the analytical and the interpretive being jammed together, in fact, in one sentence, with care meaning both things. It's a sleight of hand, it's a segue, and this is what Clarke reminds us about. And this care, it's compassionate, sentimental, the interpretive imputation is also tacitly implied to be oppositional to, for example, care of livestock destined for the slaughterhouse, who will also be well fed and well looked after. And so this is a very particular, I would say, ethnocentric and achronological idea of kind of modern European Medicare. So what are we to say then? I mean, I sounded like I was, I respect the work that my colleagues have done at this site. All I have to add is I don't necessarily think these twins died naturally. They may have done, but even if they did, one after the other, the fact they've been in place like this and been, if you like, accorded this level of complexity is more to do with other things than a Judeo concept of reverential burial and remembrance, because Gravettian burial is neither normative nor necessarily a funerary rite. The biological and logistical risk to individuals and community of having twins or triplets required an innovative solution that was socially sanctioned. Managing this risk had the emergent benefit of increasing social control in agglomerating groups, that in the Pavlovian, Willendorf and Kostjonkin may have been periodically exceeding the Dunbar number, so beginning to grow, as I think we know in Brno and elsewhere, and in the Pavlov Hills, i.e. rising above 125 individuals, making face-to-face negotiation more difficult. So, if you like, proto-normative laws. And this etic may have been hidden to the psyches of the actors themselves. They're not necessarily thinking about what's the reproductive cost of having twins, and those twins being more likely themselves to have twins. But they may have been following emically the logic of translating this somehow, the unnatural problem of two bodies with one spirit. And we can see that this is actually a widespread, I should have maybe put this in earlier. I think I haven't got time to go through it in great detail, but Mary Douglas in her Natural Symbols books talks a lot about the lele and the pangolin. Pangolins are the world's most widely trafficked wild animal, and what makes them weird is they have one baby at a time, like humans. So that's actually, that's in all pangolin mythology. The animal seems strange because it bears single young. And in a sense, by contrast, humans seem strange when they don't. So bearing twins is often been seen as somehow animalistic because nearly all mammals bear more than one young at a time. And pangolins obviously aren't a mammal, but they are significant in doing this funny thing, and that's what's made it. I could talk more about that. Let me move to the second, so I can draw to a close quickly. How much Clarke's admonishment to keep the analytical and interpretive levels separate apply at Fleurza-Bendley? So let's just go to this one, and then I finish my examples. Well, the Fleurza-Bendley object looks very much like one of these types of Upper Paleolithic objects with dots on it. Okay, and the go-to kind of expert was Alexander Marshak, who wrote his main thesis around the idea that if you looked at dots on such artifacts, you could determine that they were of different types. Apparently, this is a lot of the work exists as drawings rather than SEM scans, and I would say proper analytics. But he produces an idea that these things may be a form of notation, that they have a beginning and an end. And from this object, for example, which is in the Peabody, I think, he comes up with a lunar calendar for Paleolithic societies. And this is very, very famous. It gets sucked up into lots of secondary and tertiary literature, that there is some sort of higher conception. And so that's one of the reasons, obviously, that it's required of us to look at the numbers of these dots. And I'm going to, now having criticized others, I'm going to criticize myself, because I think this is probably the most obvious mistake of all. In the prehistory of sex, I was interested in showing one of Maria Gimbutas's mother goddesses. This is the mother goddess from the Neolithic temple site of Hagar Kim in Malta. And she said it was a representation of tattooing or body paint, possibly symbolizing or referencing the 9 months of pregnancy. And on that basis, she interpreted the figurine as a representation of a pregnant female body. So this was her, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, down the back of this clay figure. In the prehistory of sex, I interpreted the figure as being involved in something different. And I actually said that no natural symbolism of 9 attaches to pregnancy. It's 10 months by the lunar calendar, which was almost certainly the one used in the Neolithic period. So it should have been 10. And I supported this claim by reference to the way full term was established in the ancient Greek world of the Hippocratic corpus, noting the closeness of the 290 days of 10 lunar months to a published average gestation in first pregnancy of 288 days. Now, I think that's clear enough. I didn't make a mistake over that. What I made a mistake over is in believing that those lines were numerical data. Because I could count them, it didn't mean that the person who made them counted them. So how do we know the lines on the figurine were made by someone with a counting system that extended that far at all? This is a pertinent question given the widespread ethnographic observation that it is not at all unusual for human societies to have much more limited labeling systems for amounts, such as 1, 2, and more than 2. This is really common, widespread. And to generally cease noticing a precise difference in number beyond what's called the subrotation range. That's something that animals and humans can do. You can see if there's more or less. You can see if sometimes if they're two equal numbers, if one has been taken away. According to pattern, there's an awful lot you can do without having an abstract concept like 10. You could even have, I say, cave art with a finger missing, and you still only need the concept of 1 to conceptualize and describe that. You don't possibly need the concept of 1 at all. You can just say that your finger was missing. And this is quite hard to get our heads around because we're so used to being able to count. So the ideas of larger numbers have to be built on the subrotation range in some combination with our subrotating abilities. And that's the extent to which we're able to compare the amounts of two unequally sized sets of similar objects and determine their magnitude difference. Don't believe me, there's the classic Kaufman paper in 1949, and there's a lot of recent neuropsychology and cognitive science approach to this. Marcus Giacinto's recent paper is a very good starting point if you're interested in this, but I'm not, and there's a lot in the ethnographic record about it, surprising though it may seem. So my guess is that in the Gravettian, there was possibly the number 3. There was 1, 2, and 3. In art, there's very little that looks numerical. I mean, there's a weird gap between double and triple burials and triple representations and symmetrical doubles, or asymmetricality, as in the Brunel marionette burial and marionette itself. There's some play with symmetric mirroring and symmetricality, and then what's in the middle. So I wouldn't mind betting, or my guess is that the Gravettian had 1, 2, and 3 in some way, whether fully abstract or whether exemplified through some exemplars, I don't know. But there's a huge gap between that and what Marshak proposes. And nobody's really pointed that out before. I mean, how can you have lunar calendars and sort of huge long counts, and yet you don't have, for example, an accurate representation of, a spider, for example. And you may say, well, you've got 4-legged animals on Lascaux, but again, you don't need the number 4 to do that. 2 at the front, 2 at the back. So I think, there's the reason that I put this spider cave thing up. The spider actually is, probably has 8 legs on this side and 8 legs on the other side. And who knows, and it's quite late. So it's after the fall of the Mesoamerican, some of the earlier Mesoamerican empires, 200 to 500. We can't date it terribly well. I don't know, but this was because I was searching everywhere. I wrote to my friend Paul Barn. I said, where's there something with 8 legs? Because that would be significant. Well, the first actually really clear example is on Göbekli Tepe, where we've got a clearly 8-legged scorpion. And I would imagine that by the time we get to Göbekli Tepe and the threshold, the very end of the Upper Paleolithic in Anatolia, and the edge of the Neolithic, that we may have issues of needing to count livestock and make equivalencies between people and animals, for example. So where do we go then analytically? when we moved away from the word art object, that's the thing, that's my email to Urs and Jean-Nicolas. I said, it's my guess, right? This is interpretation ahead of analysis. We need to do some more analysis. I said, it's an all-weather choice among bow hunters today, and the grip pattern's an obvious one, as on the global knives I use in my kitchen, but which are still grippy even when greasy. I don't think the number's important here at all. This is part of a fitting. And Urs bounced back with, hey, maybe it's like one of these harpoon fit. We don't know, okay? But this is why I didn't want to call it art. And I don't want to count it, because we need to do the analytical bit of it first. Analytical theory, the nature of the relationship between the observations, which become the data, these last couple of slides, and their subsequent operational treatment under selective modeling, testing, analysis, experimentation, storage, and publication. Done. And remember, all data are captured. There are almost infinite amounts of data that can be got off one object. You are the person who selects that and makes it data. And interpretive theory, the nature of the relationships between archaeological patterns, done by testing expectations derived by analogy against observations manipulated by analysis, given 2, 3, and 4. And remember, expectations derived by analogy are subject to the sociological paradigm, sensu Margaret Masterman. It's 5 past the hour, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Maybe can you have the light turned on and we see each other? Okay, you didn't make it easy for us, and I'm wondering how to start a discussion. But I guess I'll ask the more experienced ones that they would like to comment first on what we heard. Martin, thanks.
Thank you. I think that your lecture made a very good point, important for the current debate on the further development of archaeology and on the importance which trends or methods like bioarchaeology, archaeology methods, and similar methods, isotopic analysis, can have for the further future development of archaeology. And if I understood you well, I think that your point was that these new methods, in fact, cannot save archaeology themselves unless we have a complex social theory which these new methods, biological methods, are matched with. So without a complex social theory, these methods cannot contribute so much, if anything, to the development of archaeology. And I think that your example of the Romitory burial illustrated this very well, because bioarchaeology says something, but we think we understand it, but in fact we don't, unless having a complex social theory. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. No, thank you. I mean, that's probably put it more clearly. I didn't want to go into all of the challenges of the ADNA and so on work, and I have a foot in both camps to some extent. So I'm working with people who work on that, and I would give, I mean, to give. There are several other examples one could give. I mean, for example, a very good example of the sociological paradigm, which I got into some trouble with, and which has now kind of become much less of a problem in the Buried Soul. 20 years ago, I had a chapter called The Edible Dead, which built on work by Marvin Harris and early anthropology to say, well, you know, why not cannibalism? It was recorded by ethnographers in the 19th century quite a lot. There were famous sites like Jukudienne, where we can't now re-examine it, and you know, Bichiskala and lots of these things. And these were considered by the 1980s to be bad data, to be sensationalist, and you know, why would you be interested in that? And my feeling was that that was a classic example of Masterman's sociological paradigm, that we didn't want to think about ourselves like that, and therefore undermined the data. And what was very interesting then in around the same time, so we're talking about maybe about 5 years later, we had the outbreak of new variant CJD in Britain, the mad cow disease. And that's a prion protein disease, and which was first discovered by Gajdusek in Papua New Guinea in the case of the foray, who got this disease called kuru. And so prion protein diseases were discovered through understanding the endocannibalistic funerary rites of the foray. Even that was at the time disputed that that could have been the case, but it's very clear that the epidemiology fitted the fact that endocannibalism was stopped by colonial authorities in the 1950s, and it was an older generation in which kuru, and among women who dealt with corpses and young children who had been around their mothers at the time, that was where the epidemic spread. But two researchers in epidemiologists, John Collins and Richard Mead, I think, published this very encouraging piece of data. My daughters were quite young at the time, and we've been a few fairs where they wanted to eat the really rubbish hamburgers, and then the mad cow disease came in, and I was going, everyone was getting, parents were getting worried, you know, are they going to get it? And Mead and Collins then said, well, look, it looks like we've got genetically evolved resistance to this sort of disease. And they say in their paper, and this and it's global, and that it looks like there must have been previous episodes of outbreaks of kuru-like disease in archaic human populations during and after our diaspora. And so there's a smoking gun, you know, there's a scientific smoking gun. I'm in a sense turning this the other way around, because we've got to have adequate sociological modeling, but it's got to be, it can't be bound by a kind of a polite social anthropology yeah.
Yeah, I think on one hand, listening to what you were saying, some of Clarke's, at the beginning, like presenting what Clarke said or wrote, some of the ideas, when you see them written, you think like, well, what else? That's the logical steps. And nevertheless, these things don't happen. And thanks to Martin for raising the ADNA discussions. And it's not only about ADNA, but this is especially when the first results came, and what I followed in the AGN, there was this paper with 5 people being tested, and they came to large-scale conclusions about the end of Bronze Age and about how the Greeks were autochthonous to Greece, which is possibly the case, but you can't make these conclusions based on 5 individuals. Okay, in the meantime, because specifically with this paper, there was a major backlash and many reviews and discussions came in. And even, I don't want to say ethic commissions, like archaeology is not usually being analyzed by ethic commissions, but in this case it happened. But now with more data then the ADNA analyses are more stable or more clear, but nevertheless it's not easy and not as straightforward. But I like when you send me these pictures and I saw the bone artifact. There I go, interpretation. No, yeah, I think it is an artifact. I felt like, not knowing what it is, I felt like, they likely think it's a figurine or something. But then my first thought was, well, it could be a handle or something, which is what you suggested in the end. But it didn't. But you, in the email that you sent me, you said that you will be presenting also early medieval, that you will go into early medieval period. Was there something that you wanted to stress and you didn't include?
Well, I was going to actually talk about this issue of slavery and its invisibility, because I've been publishing on this at the moment, and I know that, there are colleagues in the room who are looking at the literary background to that, and where is the signature of it archaeologically, and then of course when you don't have the literature for it, is there any signature? And I've suggested, just to be radical again, that the Venus of Willendorf, and particularly the Venus from Kostionki, if you know the one from Kostionki, which is Gravettian, that's a broken figurine of a pregnant woman. The head and the legs are missing, but she's naked and she's shackled. So she has rope around her wrists, right? It's a famous piece, you can have a look at it. Well, it's not a mother goddess, right? And if you look at Willendorf, she's no eyes, right? Very clear genital area, but no face. Head down, arms with these two bands on top. And in the paper that's in Jankowiak and Bierman, the most recent paper, Taylor 2021, which is called The Arrogation of Slavery, I've suggested that we've got a major problem again in saying slavery can only go back as far as there are records of it, or only so far as there's money, and therefore it's chattel slavery. And the idea that there aren't indigenous relations of dependence, indeed what Engels called the slavery latent in the family in one of his better phrases, but Catherine Cameron's argued the same thing in Captives, really, that lots of communities they capture children and women and use them as their domestic slaves, enculture them. They may then become, in a sense, manumitted and become kin. But we're seeing that pattern in the early Neolithic, in the LBK now, using the new data, the new DNA data, we can see that. And I was going to use that as a medieval, talk about its absence in the medieval period as well, and the challenge of analysing the scale. But in the end, I decided that I would build in a nascent criticism of Graeber and Vengro, and just put that in as a piece of this lecture, because I've got the more thoroughgoing piece to write about that. Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions? I will check online.
Questions at the back?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we always do that? Mentioning customary that issues are functional, that they serve a purpose?
Should we assume that our functional, that they serve a purpose?
Yeah.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Carlo Cioffi Ravilla's cultural evolutionary theory, but I mean, basically, communities in Nutri, his so-called canonical theory is that we face challenges, threats from outside. I'm very interested in how we cope with risk, and it depends how we conceptualize that risk. And sometimes we may not conceptualize it. Sometimes we conceptualize it wrongly. Sometimes we conceptualize the risk in the correct way, and we take collective action, and the risk is averted, but the collective action it wasn't the actual thing that averted the risk. It can be accidental. And sometimes our collective actions build the kinds of complexity that allow us to become more able to counter and reduce risk. But it then depends what those risks precisely are and how you define them. And that was something that I could have talked about today. I didn't have enough time. What is the primary risk, for example, of the Wachtberg twins to that community? Is it actually perceived to be a downstream genetic risk of having ever more twins, and with the attendant difficulties for a mobile community, or is it seen emically as a psychological supernatural risk of some sort of chaos that is seen as a panic? And it may be that the action is done traditionally without any knowledge of what the final reproductive risks might be, because communities that didn't do that died out. Right? So there's that filter bifurcation going on the whole time because of the enormous number of failed ongoing cultural communities. So obviously the ones who've been successful de facto either made the right decisions or were lucky. And some of them made the wrong decisions and were lucky. Does that help?
Yeah, I just really don't understand how our interpretive approach being completely devoid of sociological paradigms, because some of these societies died out for the twins situation. We're referring to some communities that were still extant today, isn't that?
Yeah, I know. So that you're making a point, it's a very, very important point, and it worries me a lot. It's behavioural utilitarianism, and is the ethnographic background that I'm using valid to interpolate in our interpretations of societies that no longer exist? And yeah, that keeps me up at night. And and I think we've somehow got to draw on a whole range of data, like Charles Darwin did in the expression of the emotions in man and other animals, for example, which I'm rereading at the moment, about, dogs really do smile. There is a background where we can use a lot of, where we have to patch in from all sorts of directions to understand mammalian psychology, sociality, and so on. And we've got to use a lot of Alison Wiley distinguished as source side and subject side work. Some of it has to come straight out of archaeology itself, which is what David Clarke was very clear that we had to do in the purest possible, most neutral and objective terms. But then with our imported analogies, we've got to be prepared to be very wide-ranging, I think, somehow to counter that worry. Yes. Horrible. I wish you hadn't mentioned. No, I mean, no, it's quite right. Latent in everything I've said. Yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for a very interesting contribution about the archaeology theory. It's not very common to discuss these things on such a level here in Czech Republic and local lectures. But I had a certain, or intrigued me, and I wanted to ask you about the concept of the natural death. Because I always struggle to understand it, what we actually meant, because I'm mostly specialized on the Roman period. And from that, I know that from the ancient and historical sources, it's frequently used, especially, for example, describing life of the emperors. So it only has history, obviously. There are these emperors who die in bed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a laughing quote.
Yeah.
Or died of old age.
Yes.
Especially Marcus Aurelius died of old age.
Sure.
And it's always compared with these emperors who died unnaturally.
Of course, yes.
And so,
yeah. Yes. Well, I think I should then apologize and rewind and say yes. Obviously, after the first person to imply that there can be natural death is probably Hippocrates of Halicarnassus in the 5th century BC when he makes that famous statement about, no, and Herodotus also says, no disease is more divine than any other. I think when he's talking about the Scythians' impotence, he says they blame it on the goddess for, I can't remember what they blame it on, but I think, and Hippocrates says, well, actually the reason for the Scythians' impotence is because they ride horses and it does a lot of damage to their male anatomy by the constant jolting of their horses. So that you're quite right that theme, in a sense, of detached medicine is coming through then, and of course it may have been coming through in the Egyptian Old Kingdom actually, but at that point, I'm not specialised enough to say, but I was talking, I guess, more about the global ethnographic situation of the last, say, 500 years, or how it is today in many communities. And it tends to revert once you get outside those situations of kind of analytical medicine, Dioscorides or so on. People tend to believe in death by witchcraft, or that death has a cause, and that cause is malign in most cases, and certainly, that it's true for a lot of the world a lot of the time. And I simply don't see how you could impute it the idea of natural. I mean, even the word natural is obviously it's a highly complex idea, and again comes out of Pliny and so on, and it's a word, it's a concept in itself that we could debate a lot. What does natural mean? And we could maybe talk more about what they mean by natural and unnatural in that sense, because there may be a slight faux ami in it as well, which I'm not sure of. That would be an interesting topic for debate. But I will thank you for the notation. When I write this up,
I was speaking briefly.
I shall nuance that.
Because in order to have a natural death, now that we are at this topic, you have to be living long enough to die of natural death.
Yeah.
Like my grandmother, she really died in the bed at the age of 98. Yeah. But that wouldn't have happened as often, I imagine, in Paleolithic or in early prehistoric times. And so possibly back then, most people didn't die of natural death.
No.
Which makes it, which puts it in a different perspective.
Right. Yeah.
No?
Why do you think people die by natural death? People die in country that it was not expectation at the time.
Maybe.
They didn't have any breaths. So.
No, that's right. Absolutely. Very difficult to take to your bed without one.
Yeah. Good. Are there any other questions, remarks?
One at the front.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the interesting topic. I just want to ask about these three figures, which especially Henry Moore, great sculptors of yours, interested of the one group. And so this lunar calendar, which you described in the dots,
the
time is not going to circle, but the H-shaped ones, the times. And it's 44 groups of depth dots multiplied 5, it's 45. And you say that this number 9 is going to become in that shape of the figures. I just want to ask if is there any relation between this 9 and 8?
No, I mean, I think the point I'm making is that you can do numerology with all of this stuff, and there are metrical relationships. Obviously, there are. Marchand is suggesting that there is a lunar calendar that is to do with fertility in Paleolithic societies, and I'm suggesting that there isn't, that they didn't have that number, and therefore that those are not actually notations. So I'm criticizing that because I've never believed it. I think the more you look at it, the more it's like a sort of an elaborate glass bead game. You can always count the dots, and you can always divide them by something. And then when it doesn't quite work, you say, oh, it's broken at that point. It would have continued. And he often does that as well. And my friend and colleague Paul Barn had a lot of time for Alexander Marshak. I know he's a well-regarded scholar, but I simply find it increasingly, now that I've been looking at the issues of subvertation and now looking at the lack of particular, if you like, intermediate numbers or evidence for intermediate numbers in Upper Paleolithic art, I'm just inclined to think that they didn't have a counting system. I mean, why would they have needed one? Most hunter-gatherer foragers do not have a counting system beyond, 3 or 4 at the most. They just, why would you? You don't need it. And so it doesn't emerge. It's really only when you've got property transactions. It's quite obvious it comes in with the Neolithic, where you actually are swapping numbers of sheep or cattle and possibly numbers of human beings and other things like that, that you would begin to devise something that eventually becomes the old Babylonian system.
That's what we're talking about, is 10,000 years BC.
Yeah.
When the lunar calendar was born. It's the same like as Chinese, the bones, dots, which they are divided. It's the same time.
No, that's much later. I mean, the Chinese stuff on the scapulae and the oracle bones is about 8,000 years later. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for coming and listening, and also thanks to our online visitors. 16 people online.
Thank you, online people.